The conflict between Muslims and Sikhs was more than 200 years old at the time of Ranjit. Now, this is a book in which Mr. Jacquemont, he visited Punjab and he met Ranjit. And he describes on page 36 the meeting with Ranjit Singh. Ranjit was the so-called king of Punjab at the time. Ranjit was seated on a cushion in the sun on one of the garden paths. A servant standing behind him chased away the flies with the end of his waistband. On his right and left were the dozen sardars squatting on a Persian carpet near the Raja. I saluted him when some paces away by raising my hand to my forehead, and he replied in the same manner, but without rising. I advanced to the carpet and presented a nazar of 21 ducats, which is, they were made in Holland, and gold was largely imported into India in this form. Was commencing a complimentary speech when he bade me sit down quite near him, and without waiting for the end of my discourse, asked me how I was and if I were not tired by the journey, and assured me how pleased he was to see me. He spoke in Hindustani, which I understood very well, and he quite understood all the flowing phrases which I had prepared for the commencement of the interview. I had often heard of his renown, his courage, and his wisdom. I had often seen Bonaparte, and for some times I had desired to see the Bonaparte in the East. Here Ranjit bowed most affably. All my desires were fulfilled in finding myself in his presence. These are the quotations. Ranjit questioned me about my travel, asked me when I had last left France and what countries I had since seen, and examined me about their climate, riches, products, power. But it is an effort for him to speak Hindustani, and his Punjabi, which was not very intelligible to me, was translated by Mr. Ventura, who knows that language well. He did not confine himself to translating only, but took part in the conversation, as did Mr. Allard. These are the French generals which he had. Indeed, it soon became general in our little circle, though Ranjit and I bore the major part. While listening to the others, I had chance to look around me. The Raja bore no mark of his rank except his place in the center of the circle and a cushion on which he was seated. He is a thin little man with an attractive face, though he has lost one eye from smallpox, which has otherwise disfigured him little. His right eye, which remains, is very large, his nose is fine and slightly turned up, his mouth firm, his teeth excellent. He wears slight moustache, which he twists incessantly with his fingers, and a long, thin white beard which falls to his chest. His expression shows nobility of thought, shrewdness, and penetration, and these indications are correct. He wore a little turban of white muslin, rather carelessly tied, a kind of long tunic with little cape falling over his shoulder like the French riding cloak, tight trousers with bare feet. His clothes were of white cashmere tissue with little gold trimming on the collar, cuffs and sleeves, of a very comfortable and old-fashioned cut, it seems to me. For ornaments, he wore large round gold rings with pearls in them, a collar of pearls, and ruby bracelets almost hidden under his sleeves. At his side hung a sword. the gold hilt of which was encrusted with diamonds and emeralds. Wade had advised me to follow a certain etiquette. Ranjit, he told me, would only speak to me through an interpreter, and that interpreter would be Shahuddin. Ranjit would speak to him in such a low voice that I should be so far away that I should not be able to hear. I was not to look at Raja when replying through the medium of the interpreter, but none of this formality was observed. I was seated a pace away from the Raja, almost in front of him, with Messrs. Allard and Ventura near me. Shahuddin was behind me and never opened his mouth during the interview, which lasted 2 hours. In short, there was an absence of all formality. Sometimes I spoke to the Raja direct in Hindustani, and he replied the same way, or Ventura served as an intermediary. Wade no doubt expected that the Raja would receive me in full darbar, but I saw him first at what might be called private audience and never saw him otherwise. He only showed himself to me as he usually is. He told me he knew that I was a friend of the Governor-General, and for that reason he wished to do all he could to make my stay pleasant. He asked me 100 questions about Lord William Bentinck, his age, his habits, what he was doing before he came to India, the extent of his control over the governors of Madras and Bombay, and lastly his accomplishments. He asked me why, following the recent practice of Governor-General, he came to Shimla. Wade had prepared for me a diplomatic reply to this question, namely that the friendship which Governor-General felt for the Raja made him desire to be near him. But I told the truth, that it was to avoid the heat of Calcutta. Have you been in England? Certainly. Have you seen the king? Certainly, said Ventura to me in French. Certainly, I replied in Hindustani. The Raja knows. I went on, that the King of England had given me permission to travel to India. I had to see him to get that permission. How did he receive you? In his room, seated on a chair, he got up. When I entered, I saluted him, removing my hat, and he made me sit on another chair. But King George is dead. Do you know the new King William? I know his history, but do not know him personally. What was he before he was king? He was an admiral. He had passed through the other ranks. Is he popular? Very. What is his revenue? 60 crore of rupees. 60 crores? Yes. But only a crore is for himself. He cannot touch the rest. It is for the pay of the scholars, the officers, the government, the priests, the schoolmasters, for the upkeep of roads and building of fortresses. How many soldiers has he? 100,000, but most of them are out of England in his possessions. Thus he has 20,000 men in India. Do they fight well? Very well, since Bonaparte taught them how to fight. Are the company's sepoys good? They say so. As good as the Europeans? No, but they fight well as long as they have European officers to lead them. There has not been a war in India since my arrival, so this is all hearsay. What about Bharatpur? I had not then arrived, and anyway Bharatpur was only a little place which could not be defended against European size. Bharatpur a little place? Certainly. There is not a fortress in India which one would dignify by that name in Europe. War in India is game. In Bonaparte's battle, 40,000 men were killed in one day. Allard has often me that. Have you seen Bonaparte? Often. Close to? As close as I am to your majesty. Like your Majesty, he was a thin man in his youth, and like your Majesty, by his courage and wisdom, Ranjit bows at this point, he became king and greatest king in the world. Yet the English fought him and took him prisoner by treachery. What sciences do you know? I was preparing to narrate a long list when Allard said to me, all, and I repeated with the greatest of simplicity I could assume, all. But which do you know best? Astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, botany, geology, medicine, and the art of war also? Seeing my embarrassment, Ventura quickly replied for me, Your Majesty, you see, Mr. Jacquemont knows everything in the art of war as well as the rest, but he does not descend to the details of giving orders. Such things are beneath his notice. He knows these things, but he does do them himself. And I added gravely, I knew all the battle plans of the kings of Europe, from Alexander to Bonaparte, the sieges, etc. And politics, said the Raja. He has studied them deeply, said Mr. Allard. What are your principles of government? They depend on the country of which your Majesty supposes that I am king. Here, for example, I am sure that your Majesty puts in practice my own principles. A gracious bow at these compliments, and he then retails me some Machiavellian propositions which I forthwith claimed as Europeans, and I explained how the Arabs have translated the books of Greeks and how these Arabic versions have later been translated into Persian and found their way to India. But that was old knowledge, which was very little like modern science. I wished to get away from the subject of politics, but the Raja returned to it by asking, What conquest should I now undertake? With the excellent troops which you possess, your Majesty can conquer all the Asiatic countries which do not belong to England or Russia. He makes a cordial bow. But that country should I first think of, what country I should first think of conquering? Tibet? Have you been to Tibet? Your Majesty needs only send a regiment of Gorkhas, but the country is so poor that 1,000 men would find nothing to eat there. What would be the good of my taking such a country? It is rich countries that I want. Could I not take Sindh? It is said to be very rich. But what would the British say? Your Majesty knows better than I do the terms of your treaty with Sir Charles Metcalfe in 1809. If the British have not promised protection to the provinces situated on the right bank of the lower Indus, I have no doubt that Your Majesty could invade them without risk of war with the British. I have heard a good deal about the Russians lately. They have been making conquest in Persia. What do the British in India say about them? They do not worry much. But if the Russian army advanced to attack them, what would they do? I was very tempted to reply truthfully, that is to say, they would make many excuses for your Majesty for necessity for which they would be driven of invading your Majesty's territory and carry their frontiers from Satluj to the Indus. But I made the reply more agreeable to everybody. I said, it would not matter to them. Would not the Russians, in order to invade India, have to traverse your Majesty's dominion? Would your Majesty quietly allow yourself to be dethroned, with an army well disciplined and commanded by able French generals like these gentlemen, indicating Allard and Ventura, who would have already fought against the Russians under Bonaparte and know their tactics? Your Majesty would not leave to the British the trouble of driving them away. Without the European discipline which your Majesty has introduced in your army, it could not offer an effective resistance to the Russians, but if they came tomorrow, your Majesty would, I am sure, give them a warm reception. Whereupon, not in reply to my words, but to an evil thought which had passed through his mind, he affirmed the sincerity of his friendship for the British, The British and I, said he, have one heart between us. As I was nervous that any word might be repeated in India, I spoke warmly of the immense power and good faith of the British. I spoke as if I were myself British, and with all the more pleasure as I had only to tell the truth in order to sustain in the eyes of Raja the semi-official position which I believed that I enjoyed and to which I owed the consideration with which I have been treated. When does Mr. Burns arrive? Is he not expected every day? But they say that the people of Sindh have refused to let him pass. What will the British do if that is true? I suppose they will send your Majesty's horses by another route. Will they allow themselves to be treated in this way by those scoundrels of Sindhis? Ranjit saw from my replies my dislike to talking politics, and changing the subjects, he asked abruptly, "Is there a God?" As I had already said that I knew everything, I did not know what to reply. So I took counsel with Ventura, who advised me to speak the truth without any disguise. "Without doubt," I replied, relying upon commonplaces. "Who has made the heavens and earth and ourselves except God?" Ranjit said, "But who made God himself?" "My scientific knowledge does not cover these matters. All the priests of Europe could answer your Majesty better." "The priests of this country would not stop like that. As for me, I do not believe their stories, and I prefer to remain in ignorance. But do you not believe that there is another world, another life?" I replied, "We shall know that later on, but no one will ever come back from that country if it exists, with the result that nobody knows anything about it." "Are you all of the same caste in Europe?" "By no means. There are two sects among Christians as among Muslims." "Do you eat together?" "Yes, as the Muslims do." "Do they eat beef in France?" Mr. Allard had put me up to this beforehand, so I made a grimace at this question. "Eat beef?" I cried. "Kill so useful an animal? No, certainly not in France, where in any case little meat is eaten." "But the British eat beef." "Oh, the British, yes, certainly." And the Raja and his Sikh friends showed themselves shocked, though this was no news to them. However, the scandalous behavior of the British so overcame them that there was a pause in the conversation. The Raja reopened it by speaking of medicine and desiring to consult me. Formerly he had been a very heavy drinker, but his stomach can no longer stand spirits. He can barely take a little opium, and the impossibility of getting drunk without making himself ill, combined with premature impotence brought upon his excessive debauches, has deprived him of all the pleasures, a loss to which he is by no means resigned. Modesty makes me complain of his stomach only, but I and everyone else knew what he meant by that. I told him that I had discussed his symptoms, for he is a hypochondriac, at great length with Dr. Murray, and that I would think them over carefully and consult my books before prescribing the remedies. He then made a sign with his hand, which Allard told me was a sign of farewell. We got up, myself with my knees sore from my long and unaccustomed squatting. I saluted as on entering, and we turned our back on the Raja, and I departed. Ventura had some orders to receive about his troops and remained sometimes after us. As soon as gone, the Raja exclaimed, "He is certainly French. He has changed his position 20 times, and he gesticulates when speaking. He speaks high and then low and then laughs." I had avoided in this first interview mentioning my wish to leave Lahore at once and proceed to Kashmir. Ranjit said to Ventura, "He wants to go to Kashmir. He shall go wherever he likes, and I will look after him." Close to him on the left, the Raja had his principal minister and favourite, Raja Dihan Singh, an ugly little boy of 10, the son of Dhyan Singh, some of the Rajas of the same class, and a very fat, ugly individual who alone was dressed in European uniform like that of Allard and Ventura, though of a curious type. This was a general who commanded those regular troops which are not under the orders of these gentlemen. All of them, except ourselves, joined their hands together when addressing the Raja. Like them, we address them as Maharaj or Maharaja-ji, and in speaking of him in his presence as Raja Sahab or Sarkar. This last term is the one he invariably uses when speaking of himself. He would say, "The Sarkar is delighted to see you. The Sarkar's stomach is very weak." In the same way, he uses one term when addressing others, tum, meaning you, which is the language of superiority. In British India, one gets used to so much presumption of dignity and personal importance that I was quite shocked by this familiarity. Ranjit, while speaking, uses many expressive gestures, a most unusual thing for an Indian, and it is all the more curious as these gestures are French. He often snaps his finger, bending his elbow and lifting up his right arm. With him, this is a cheerful way of saying, "Be it so, well done, the matter is settled." The next day, one of his ministers, Fakhruddin, who is also a doctor, came to take me to Allard's house to conduct me again to the Raja. M. Court was invited with me, but I and the worthy fakir arrived more than an hour before him. I found Ranjit very much in the same position as the day before, and surrounded by the same people, though not quite so many of them. He had before him a square plate covered with flowers, and amused himself from time to time by pulling some of them to pieces. He made me sit near him and began a conversation as desultory as that of the day before. This morning he has consulted Ventura to inquire if he should receive me on the horseback, as the head of some of his regiment had even had the rehearsal of the parade. But not content with the turnout of his troops, he had dismissed them. However, he had picked company near his tent, which was brought up and went through its exercises in front of us, very well done so far as I could see. My admiration won a salute from the Raja. He asked me how many soldiers there were in France, how many guns, fortresses, cavalry, the scales of pay. I carefully refrained from telling him the pay of the generals, for he would certainly have thought of cutting down the pay of Allard and Ventura. He asked me if I had seen the King of Delhi, and on my replying in the affirmative, inquired what ceremonies took place on my presentation in the Darbar. I laughed when I told him of the infinite number of bows that I had to make, and the absurd picture I presented when invested with a khilat. This amused Ranjit very much, but I continued, "That sort of thing is only done for persons of distinction." And he appeared a little surprised that the British allowed it to go on. I told him that it was the custom in Europe to surround dethroned princes with all the exterior marks of respect in order to console them for their fall, and that all these ridiculous ceremonies to which the British lent themselves before the great Mughal did not amount to much, since they were entirely voluntary and this prince merely a prisoner of the British government. "Did you see Shah Shuja and Shah Zaman at Ludhiana?" "Yes. Captain Wade took me to see them both." "Did you make as many salutations as to the old emperor at Delhi?" "No, only a single one on entering." "Did they ask you to sit down?" "No. Wade and I remained standing." "Indeed. That was very good of you." We laughed at this Eastern etiquette among ourselves, and we submitted it the more willingly as we had the power to refuse. Is it not from Captain Wade that the two former kings of Kabul received their monthly pension? Does not your Majesty believe that if Governor-General made it a condition of this favour and of their being allowed to resort in British territory, that Captain Wade and other officer of distinction should be allowed to be seated before Shah Zaman, that both would agree at once? Ah, all those kings of Delhi and Kabul are fooled, who have never known how to be the master in their houses. It is only your Majesty among all the kings of the East who knows how to be that. Here there was a deep bow from Ranjit. To pass to the subject of medicine which he wished to reopen, he opened his trousers and showed me his stomach. Look at that, said he. I was very ill 4 years ago, but Dr. Murray made me put on this bandage, and I am much better now. It was a hernia which had prevented him from walking or riding, and for which, after he had tried the prescription of all the charlatans of Punjab without success, he was at last compelled to send for Dr. Murray and keep him with him for some months. Like all hypochondriacs, he was full of medical treatments, and I listened quietly to his remark on heat and cold, dryness and damp. Personally, I did not know sufficient about his maladies to be able to prescribe for him. I felt his pulse, looked at his tongue, asked him several questions, and promised to think over the matter again and prepare him some remedies. Mr. Court had arrived in the meantime and remained a silent spectator at our conversation, for he does not speak Punjabi and Ranjit understands Hindustani better than Court's Persian. He did not seem as much at ease in the Darbar as Allard and Ventura, and his manners were more Asiatic. The Raja now began to speak of his proposed trip and talked much of Kashmir, which strangely enough he had never visited. I spoke as if I had all along had his consent to make this journey. It is an earthly paradise, said he, but be careful, the people there are greatest rogues, thieves and liars. But the girls, what do you think of them? And he showed me 5 charming girls coming towards us from a neighboring tent. The Raja made them sit before me and laughingly inquired what I thought of them. They were a long way the prettiest girls I had seen in India, and I should have admired them in any country. They were richly and gracefully dressed, except that they had too many gold and pearl ornaments on the ears and forehead. Also, they were fully painted according to the custom of their country, their lips bright red from chewing betel, and rims of their eyelids darkened with antimony, with another large white circle outside, which gave an extraordinary brilliance to their naturally large bright eyes. Their skin was light brown, their cheeks red, and the features regular. They are charming, I cried. And as my expression showed my delight, Ranjit proceeded to tease me on the subject. Ah, said he, what a thing it is to be young. With such pretty girls, I replied, it is not necessary to be young. Ranjit then started to laugh, and the conversation would have taken a course then. But Mr. Court had not warned me to appear as cold as ice and disgusted at the Raja's exhibition. But I found these Kashmiris so charming, and I already been so emphatic on the subject that I could not back out. Can you sing? I asked the Raja. Do you want to hear them? Most willingly. And he made them sing in low tones several songs in Kashmiri, Punjabi and Persian. I do not know if it was because they sang in low voice without accompaniment of infernal din of musicians who usually accompanied them, or if it was because I looked at them rather than listened to them, but their song appeared pleasing to me. I said, however, with a disdainful air that such music could only amuse a European for a few minutes. Then, seeing I would not take the bait, Ranjit told them to be quiet and soon afterward dismissed me. Court retired with me. I told that Ranjit had once taken him off alone on a boating trip. He tried to make him drunk and not succeeding, sent for these girls or similar ones and make them make all sort of advances to him. M. Court played the part of Joseph, and Raja finally said, "Do these girls arouse no sensation in you? Are you a eunuch?" "So far as the women of the bazaar are concerned," replied Court. And the Raja changed the subject and sent them away. "Perhaps," said Court, "he will send them to me. Be on your guard. He will send them to you. Be on your guard. You can only amuse yourself with them at the expense of your dignity and character." I was much afraid he could send them, for they were so pretty that I am doubtful if my virtue would have stood the strain. However, since Ludhiana, I have drunk only water and eaten only vegetables and sweetmeat. The Raja, who keeps himself informed of my smallest action, knew that, and every day amused himself by sending me fresh presents of Kabul grapes. Everyone knows my simple habits. As it is the fashion in Lahore to admire everything that I do, I have got a reputation for sanctity. Ranjit, who demands medicine from everybody, takes some of them. I knew that. I also knew that he was in the habit of amusing himself by making his concubines, friends, and servants take them. I therefore only sent him some harmless pills, and for a stimulant, a flask of brandy, which he would have taken no notice of under the name of brandy, but which I called Purana Cognac Sharab, indicating that a very nice punch could be made by mixing it with rose sharbat. The Raja thanked me, but he wanted something more complicated, something mysterious, sublime in the way of potion, such as dust of a precious stone, etc. I then satisfied his taste, and he sometimes complained of acidity in the stomach. I prescribed a preparation of burnt pulse, nothing more or less than calcium carbonate, and some other medicines equally harmless or useful, made in the most expensive and complicated way. I also added some cantharides pills, warning him not to take too much. This time he was delighted, and his minister doctor came to me to tell me that I had divined all the Raja's need. The superintendent of the garden then arrived with some of the fruits most rare at that time. The Raja left the neighborhood of Lahore for 2 days to go out hunting. Before leaving, he had sent to ask me if I wanted to go with him, but knowing that I should be overcome with hunger and fatigue, I excused myself, adding it would delay my start for Kashmir. So this is a interesting long discourse which basically explains the kind of personality Mr. Ranjit had. It obviously was a very inquisitive type of personality. There is more to it, which I would state later by similar and different persons, which tell us more about the king in another post. But it should be mentioned that Ranjit basically did not trust his Sardars, and it is said that at one time his corps commander was a Muslim, Corps Commander Lahore was a Muslim. And there are also instances in which what happens is that if a governor is not giving the sufficient revenues, he is eaten up, he was lashed, he was tortured, he was imprisoned, and once the money came out, and if it was considerable money, he would reinstate them again in that post. There are certain descriptions which say that in Ranjit's court, nobody had a permanent post. Some day you are working as one minister of one thing, the next day as something else. But some of the reviewers have objected to that, and they said that there were at least 10 departments in the later part of the Ranjit's time period. There are many other books, some of them written by the British, which are quite scandalous type of the Sikhs in general. And then, one has to mention 2-3 things one has to mention. One was the closeness of Dhyan Singh and the other 2 brothers, one of whom later became the founding uh, prince of the uh, Kashmir, independent princes under the British. And then there is the Fakir brothers. Fakir brothers were you might say, the scholars of they were Muslims, they were scholars of the court. And he was a kind of personal secretary, writing letters, and he was also a foreign minister. And descendants of Fakir brothers also played a part in further politics of the region. And if I'm not wrong, one of their descendants was a key ally of Mr. During the Musharraf's regime in Pakistan. With this, I end this. But since the topic of the Sikhs and their continuous turmoil before and their conflict with the Mughals, which was probably necessitated by the reason that Mughals always feared that one day they might have to go back to Kabul, running from India. So they always made sure that there are some Mughal tribes on the way to Kabul. They were settled there, and they wanted things clear. And the rise of the Sikhs in the same area on the route obviously was the sure reason for a conflict. And this conflict lasted for more than 150, 200 years. And that didn't stop with the Mughals. The last conflict between Sikhs and Muslims was in 1947, which was not obviously conflict in that way, but it was obviously massacres and so on. So the topic of the Sikhs is of continuous importance to Pakistan, whether it is the military, whether it is the civil aspects, whether it is the regional politics, and so on. So with this I end that, and I hope you have enjoyed the description of the personality of Ranjit Singh and his very interesting questions from the visitor. Thank you very much for your patience.